James.
Good evening.
Welcome to Senegal. It's a pleasure to have you here. James, do you know what a griot is?
A griot. I think a griot is it's a sort of like an oral historian. It's there's like it's like a caste, like a well-defined group of people who maintain like history and genealogy, and they're often musicians and bards. And I think Salif Keita maybe was from a family of famous griots, no, in Mali, who was a musician I like a lot. Yeah.
Yes, and as Mali, Senegal, we have also a tradition of griots. And what I'm going to start doing is to be a griot for a moment. You are someone who deserves some eulogies as well. So I'm going to tell a bit of your bio and embarrass you a little bit in front of the whole world. So you're an economist, I mean, can I say that? And a political scientist. You have conducted influential research in the field of political and economic development and the relationships between political power and institutions and prosperity. You have explored the underlying causes of economic and political divergence, both from a historical lens and today as well. You use theory, quantitative methods, data, and you also live among the people in field work to ask your questions. And one of the places you are very interested in is Africa, and that's why we are here, and Latin America. In fact, your interest in Africa is not just a footnote. I want to call you an African thinker in how you engage with Africa. You are a fellow of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. You were born from Britain, and you are now a professor, a university professor at the University of Chicago. Your work has been distinguished with many awards, one of which is the 2024 Swedish Rich Bank. The Swedes, it's very hard always to pronounce the Swedish Central Bank's, the Nobel Prize of Economics. Congratulations again, James Robinson. And today, we're going to take a moment a little bit to celebrate your award in Africa. So you go to Nigeria often, and this is your first time in Senegal. Tell us, have you had a chance to celebrate the award in Africa, and how are you feeling your time in Senegal?
No, we haven't celebrated it too much, although my friends in Nigeria are organizing a big party. I have a chieftaincy title in a village in Imo State called Umuchezi, and they're organizing a celebration for me in Nigeria in the village, which I think will be very exciting. So that's the sort of first time, probably it's the first time I've been at the University of Nigeria also since the prize, because I had to cancel my plan last year. So that would be good. And for Senegal, I'm just, learning and trying to understand and compare and think, and it's very, very different from Nigeria. I think, very different. It's much calmer than Nigeria. I think, people's identities and relationships are sort of interesting. Like in Nigeria, you have a lot of tensions between different groups and sort of polarization between different groups. And that doesn't seem to be important here at all. So I think there's a lot of fascinating things to try to explore here.
Great, and a lot of fascinating things we'll explore in this conversation. And one difference already, I think, is we do not celebrate as much as, I think Nigerians have a much more grandiose celebration. So let's call this the pre-celebration before the one you have in Nigeria. So let's start, I want to start a little bit where you began in your journey and in your intellectual journey, thinking of comparative development in Africa. You have a piece of work that has been cited close to now 22,000 times. Every day you open Google Scholar or website, and this number keeps climbing. So this paper, this research is very famous, which is called The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, work that you have written with Daron Acemoglu of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Simon Johnson of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So can you walk us through the inception of this idea, and then what this idea is really about, and why has it been so transformational in the way in which economists think of comparative development?
Yeah, I think you know, I think when I was young, I was interested in this question of development, and I took classes on economic development when I was an undergraduate in London, and then at Yale when I was a PhD student. But I felt this was, like, first of all, it just seemed so simplistic, the way that economists thought about these questions, you know, like the difference between poor countries and rich countries, and poor countries were just like rich countries, they just had less stuff, you know, less capital, or worse, technology, or, you know, and you know, my father, you know, spent his whole life working overseas. I grew up in the 1960s in Barbados and Trinidad, and then we lived a little bit in West Africa before we moved back to England, and then my father couldn't stand it in England, so he immediately moved back to Africa. So I grew up in this house, you know, I knew a little bit about the rest of the world, and I grew up in this house full of books about Africa and maps, and you know, and I sort of thought I knew something about the world, and when I took a class in economics, I didn't see any of this richness or reflected in it, and I didn't understand why, you know. And I think Professor Acemoglu, you know, who grew up in Turkey, in Istanbul, when we met each other, we kind of had the same impulse, which was we learned all this mathematics and statistics, but there were always other things we were interested in, and we had this kind of image in our heads of the difference between different societies and all these things that could be relevant for explaining, you know, why countries were economically successful or not, and we didn't see it reflected in any kind of course. So we wanted to figure out how to study that, but of course we had no idea how to study it, absolutely no idea how to study it. And I think the moment where we sort of got a kind of entry point was, you know, was we were at a conference and somebody was talking about the economic development of Haiti in the Caribbean, the poorest country in the Americas. And they were talking about the rate of economic growth in Haiti between 1970 and 1995. And we went out into the coffee break and we said to each other, like, why does anyone care about that? You know, if you want to understand the underdevelopment of Haiti, you have to go back to the 18th century when Haiti was, you know, the most vicious slave plantation economy in the Caribbean, and then you have to think about the Haitian Revolution, and you have to think about the whole kind of historical process that created Haiti. And I think that observation kind of triggered a whole, like, a panorama of how, okay, if we're going to study this, we have to think about history, we have to think about European colonialism, we have to think about, so sort of trying to bring all of that into a kind of a model that economists could understand and relate to and could kind of learn from. So again, that took it took some more time to do that, but I think that was the initial seed that sort of said, okay, we need to think about colonialism. How do we think about variation in colonialism? When you start thinking about colonialism, you see colonialism created very different societies in different parts of the world. You know, why was that? You know, what created different types of colonialism, and what were the forces at play? And I think, you know, that led to the idea of that paper, which was, again, you know, we went back and we started reading history of colonialism and trying to think about, you know, variation in colonial societies. And I read a beautiful book by a historian, Alfred Crosby, which is called Ecological Imperialism, where he tells the story of how the Pilgrim Fathers who founded this colony in Plymouth, the famous Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, their original plan was to colonize in Guyana in South America. But the first English people, the Scottish people actually, who went out there, had all died of yellow fever, of a kind of yellow fever epidemic. So the Pilgrim Fathers decided, oh, this is much too unhealthy. We can't go to South America. Let's find somewhere else which is healthier. So then we had the idea that somehow variation in the historical disease environment was a source of variation in the type of colonies that appeared. So we just started trying to collect historical data to look at what type of factors influence the structure of colonial society and the consequences of that for comparative economic development. So it was a sort of specific thing that allowed us to kind of find a tractable way of like entering into this discussion and trying to show economists, look, if you want to understand these huge differences in the world, in world inequality, you have to look at history and you have to think about the historical and institutional and political processes that shaped these societies and made these societies, you know, what they are. And I think, you know, when I did that, of course, you know, I was young, not that young, but I was younger and ignorant in many ways. And I think you could think of the subsequent, you know, 25 years or 30 years or whatever as trying to sort of get much deeper into what matters, you know, how institutions are shaped, how societies are shaped. And I think, you know, maybe we're going to come to that, but I think, you know, in terms of Africa, for me, it's like trying to understand, this is not just about colonialism. Like, we focus very much on colonialism, but of course, like, what was there before colonialism in Africa is enormously important to understand, and what of that has persisted to the current day, you know, that's something that I've been trying to understand a lot.
And it has really shaped the way in which people think of institutions, the difference between extractive institutions that could lead to bad outcomes, political outcomes, and inclusive ones that are more likely to lead to prosperity. Now, in your Nobel lecture, you said that you had to have a journey as you were born British and you had to unlearn some things to see Africa in a certain new way and understand Africa. And from that work, this work that you did that was very influential on the colonial origins of comparative development, which really Africa plays this role of being a natural experiment to highlight this insight you had with your co-authors on institutions. Then you went further to get more evidence. And I would like you to expound on some of this evidence you have and that you talk about in your paper, in your book. You wrote a book that's very influential and very well known, Why Nations Fail.
Yeah.
Can you tell us as well what was the purpose of this book that is more of a general audience book in comparison to the more academic initial paper, and what are some of the examples that really you remember very fondly of this of the argument in Why Nations Fail?
Yeah, I think you know, as I said, when we wrote those initial papers, you know, I was very conscious of my level of ignorance, and I'm very question-driven. So I wanted to, you know, we became very successful professionally, and you know, but I was very conscious of wanting to deepen my understanding of what was going on in the world. And the first place I started doing that actually was not in Africa, but in Colombia. You know, because I had a classmate, not a classmate, he was below me, but a very good friend who was Colombian, who went back to Colombia to start teaching, and he invited me to come and teach in the summer in Bogota, which I did for the next 28 years every summer. Because I got to Colombia and I realized, okay, this was like a, you know, in Colombia they'd say caldo de cultivo, like a kind of soup, of like a soup where all the things I was trying to understand were growing, you know, violence, politics, dysfunctional politics, institutional problems, kind of just like, so okay, here's a great place to start studying this in Colombia. But I think, like, I always had this idea of trying to work in Africa, and then, but where do you start? How do you start? It's so complicated. I remember when I was a PhD student, one of my classmates was going off to Africa to collect data, and I sort of said, how can you study Africa? You don't know anything about Africa. Like, so this was sort of overwhelming for me, you know, how, you know, but at some point you have to sort of throw yourself in. And, you know, and the way I threw myself in was, you know, was around about 1996, you know, I realized that Botswana had been the fastest growing economy in the world in the previous 30 years. Everyone was talking about that, the problems with Africa and the Africa dummy and, all of these economic crises and dictatorship. And then, hold on a second, shouldn't somebody be mentioning that the fastest growing economy in the world is actually not South Korea, China, Singapore? No, it's in Africa. So then I started asking people, Botswana, why is Botswana doing so well? Why is Botswana growing so fast? No one had a clue, absolutely not a clue. I remember someone telling me once, it's next to South Africa. The whole country is run by white South Africans. Like, no, completely wrong. So I went to the library. I was teaching at the University of Southern California. I went to the library, I took out every single book I could find on Botswana, did economics, politics, anything, just trying to find an explanation. I couldn't find anything. So then I found some names, and I started emailing people at the University of Botswana, like someone wrote a book about public policy. He was working at the Ministry of Finance, still a very good friend of mine. He's now a consultant. He lives in Gaborone. So I said, I'm coming to Botswana. I'm trying to learn about Botswana. So I went to Botswana, and I had this wonderful. The first day I gave a lecture, very embarrassing. I hate to think what I talked about comparative economic development, colonial origins, things like that. We sort of had the early stages of the argument, and then I was taken out by these two historians for dinner at the university, and just started talking about Botswana society, Botswana history, Botswana sociology, like the traditional political institutions, how things worked in Botswana culture. And, for me, that was it was a kind of like, an epiphany, let me say. It was an epiphany. And I just realized, there's all these things that I just haven't understood that are relevant and that I need to understand. And, and that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years, or trying to. It's very complicated, and there's a lot to think through. But that was a real sort of revelation for me. And I think the other thing, in Why Nations Fail, we tried to put together like a lot of case studies, like things that I'd been learning, Colombia, Botswana. I started working in Sierra Leone, in 2007. I started trying to work in different places in Africa. And I think, Why Nations Fail, the reason we wrote that book was because, I was terribly inspired by Guns, Germs and Steel, for example. I don't know if anyone has read Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond. I think it's a very flawed argument, actually. But it's about these big questions, And I noticed once my father-in-law was reading Guns, Germs and Steel. And he kept on asking me questions. We were having conversations about guns, germs, and steel. And I thought, he's an engineer, petrochemicals engineer. It's like, gosh, wouldn't it be fun to write a book that could kind of engage non-academic economists? You can write these academic papers. It's full of technical jargon and statistics and stuff. It's very impenetrable. But, whenever I gave talks, you could engage people on different levels. And so I think we thought it would be wonderful to kind of engage with people at this level of Jared Diamond, of just there's lots of people out there who are not trained economists, but they're thinking about why is the world the way it is? Why is Senegal like this? Why is Botswana doing so much better than Zimbabwe? What's the right way to think about that? And so I think when we wrote Why Nations Fail, we tried to take these ideas, like you mentioned, this distinction between extractive institutions and inclusive institutions, which was this, it's very simplistic, that dichotomy, but it's useful for developing the argument. And then we tried to tell the kind of story of the emergence of modern inequality in the world, the kind of the industrial revolution and the rise of the Western societies, and how colonialism had spread kind of underdevelopment around the rest of the world, and just through this lens of extractive and inclusive institutions, with a trying to, we're educators, we're supposed to be teachers, just trying. And I noticed I was teaching undergraduates, at Harvard at that point. And I noticed, people really engaged on this. They got excited. They would talk about the material. The students got very excited, So that was also very encouraging for me. I basically taught a class at Harvard, which was Why Nations Fail. And, and just you could see people got excited about it. So, but the Nobel lecture, I hope, goes far beyond that, because I think what I've learnt, trying to study much more deeply, other countries is, I grew up in Britain, and I consider myself to have been mostly in Britain, I consider myself to have been very fortunate. I grew up in a world with free education, free healthcare, secure, like very high level of public services. I had access to university. I didn't pay a penny. The government even gave me money, to study. I had all these scholarships. It was an extremely privileged environment, and most people in the world don't live in such a privileged environment. And I had to try to understand, like, why is that? And and I think to do that, you have to understand. You have to treat other people's societies with much more respect than most academic economists do. Like people who study development, they want to think about Senegal as like a failed version of Britain. What you want to do, like what is Francis Fukuyama says, every country wants to be like Denmark, But I very much doubt, actually, that Senegalese people want to be like Denmark. Maybe they want to have access to the same types of things that people in Denmark do. Education, healthcare, security, whatever. But they don't want to be Denmark. Actually, they want to be themselves, And I think that you have to understand. And I think, what I try to do nowadays is to just treat everybody in a very level. I think everyone should be just treated with as much respect and interest as anybody else. Like Senegal is just as interesting to study and to take seriously as the United States or anywhere else, and we should just think of that variation, and we should treat it seriously, and we should study it, and we should respect it without making these huge value judgments about one thing is better than another. And I think, when that's something I've had to learn over time, just interacting with people and seeing how they talk about their society, how they talk about their institutions, what they value and prioritize.
Mm-hmm. And, in terms of values and prioritize, we come now to the contemporary period now of your work. You have had a lot of influence in Bogota and impact in Colombia, as there have been many students who have been economists who went on to study their country, and that's a great legacy. Now, in the case studies that you study, many of them are in Africa, to make your argument in Why Nations Fail. We find you now quoting more, I think, African thinkers and anthropologists of Africa than Diamond of Why Nations Fail, Guns, Germs, and Seal. So, apparently there is a scoop. So you have a book coming up next year, and the title is provocative. Wealth in People, Theory of Africa. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why a theory of Africa in singular? That puts a lot of people in trouble. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think, it's in social science. You try to make generalizations. And that's always difficult, because the world is complicated and there's a lot of variation and every society is different. But I always remember, when I was a student in London, I came home from at Christmas, and my mother never went to university. She was a teacher. She went to a teacher training college, but she never went to university. And she asked me, so what have you been learning in London? And I came out with something about, and I ended up by saying, oh, it's all very complicated, Mum. And she looked at me and she said, isn't it obvious that it's complicated? I mean, I never went to university. I never studied economics, but isn't it obvious that the economy is complicated? I mean, couldn't I say it's complicated? Like, you go to London and you come back and you say it's complicated? Isn't it your job to say it's actually much simpler than you thought? And try to explain. Give people something to help them understand the complexity. So she was like, okay, I really took that to heart, that message from my mother. And I think that's our job as social scientists. I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist. I appreciate all of that research and those different methodologies and different approaches to the society, but I'm a social scientist. So in social science, we try to provide simple generalizations. And I think my objective here is my objective is to provide a different way of thinking about Africa, I think very much inspired by a lot of research in African studies and other areas, which brings a much more constructive way of thinking about African development.
So let's get into that.
Yeah.
Let's get into focus on what is wealth in people.
Yeah, so by wealth in people, this is a terminology that was developed in anthropology in the 1970s. It just means when people think about wealth, like, Western society, we think about wealth, we think about material objects or the house, your house, or financial assets. But like the idea of anthropology was, in Africa, it's very common to think of wealth in terms of like personal relationships, basically, and just social networks and relationships. That constitutes wealth. Wealth is constituted by having a lot of personal relationships, and your objective is to accumulate relationships and get more relationships and build more relationships. People you can rely on, people who can help you, people you can help and who can rely on you, and just building those networks. And what I found is that I found that idea extremely helpful just in terms of doing research in Africa and thinking about the challenges of doing research. And I found it incredibly helpful in thinking about the organization of African political institutions and economic institutions.
So can you give us some examples that you use to articulate this wealth in people concept in certain countries that people are... We talked about, before we started the show, the game of Woody.
Woody.
Yes.
Well, it's I don't know if that's an example. I was going to give you a different example. This is, you could say it's a metaphor. Woody is like a metaphor for wealth in people. I always love the contrast between Woody and chess, because in Woody, what do you do? Like, all the pieces are the same, and you try to collect the pieces. You bring the pieces into your team, like, you accumulate people in some sense. If you think about chess, how does chess go? First of all, chess is like a hierarchy. It's a feudal hierarchy, and your objective is to invade the territory of the other person and destroy all their pieces and capture their queen. It's this kind of aggressive, expansionary. It's a very different sort of philosophy is captured in chess, than in Woody. I was going to give you a different example from when I started working in Congo, which I always like, which is, in Congo, if you want to make a transaction with somebody, you can never just go and do it. Like, let's say you have a car, and I want to rent your car. I want to borrow your car. My favorite, maybe the first, I should tell this story. When I was working in Kananga, I've worked in Kananga in the south of Congo for 15 years. And the first time I was there, I went with a Congolese fellow, Mwana Kasongo. So Mwana, I need to change some dollars. Can we go to change some dollars? Okay, so we go, there's a bureau de change downtown. So I have some dollars. He said, look, let's talk to this man here. I'm like, why do we have to talk to this man here? The bureau de change is over there. No, let's talk to this man here. So then we went over, and he said, we changed with this man here. And I'm like, why did we change the bureau de... No, we changed with this man here. Okay, so we changed with this man here. And that guy, he didn't go to the bureau de change. He went across the street to somebody else, and then he did the transaction. And that person went to the bureau de change. And then he came out of the bureau de change, and he went to that, and he went to that man, and then we got our Congolese francs. And I'm like, what is that? And then I realized, whenever something has to happen like that, it's always an opportunity to build relationships. You bring people into the relation. You bring people into the deal. It's beautifully illustrated in Ousmane Sembene's novel, The Money Order. If you've read Ousmane Sembene's The Money Order, it's exactly this.
Or watched.
It's this. You're always trying to make new relationships, make contacts, build, your connections and your social networks. And I've meant that's a very concrete kind of personal story.
But Ousmane Sembène comes to some of the, I think, critical and limitations of these relations. So I think we can get to the taking for given your theory. We maybe want to talk about the consequences then. And I think that Africa is known for having many different political entities, and you have done a lot of work on centralization, which is having one large state versus smaller political entities. So how does the centralization or lack of centralization in parts of Africa play and interact with the notion of wealth in people?
Yeah, I think if you look at Africa comparatively, historically, one fact that really jumps out is how decentralized politically Africa was. So with one of my collaborators, we've been trying to do some calculations of the late sort of pre-colonial period before the colonial powers divided Africa up into, how many polities, kind of politically independent entities were there in Africa. And the number we have, I don't want to talk about how we got there, and there's a lot of uncertainty, is maybe 45,000. So in Europe, there were 50 countries in that. I don't want to use the word country in Africa because maybe it has connotations that are not relevant, but just polities, like separate political societies. So why was Africa so decentralized politically? And I think what you see when you study why was it so difficult to concentrate political power, to centralize political power, to create large states in Africa? What you see is African societies created many different mechanisms that made it extremely difficult to actually concentrate power and centralize power. And I think, in the book, I give many different examples of that. And I think the fundamental reason is the sort of wealth in people, in the sense that wealth in people was institutionalized in many ways, in lineages, in clans, in descent groups. And centralization was seen as a sort of threat to those descent groups, to the clan, to the lineage. It was seen as something which would override the authority of the lineage and the clan. And so that's the reason, I think, this is simple but simplistic, but that's the fundamental reason it was opposed. And I think the other thing, which is fascinating, is that when you do see more centralized entities emerge, it's because they managed to combine these principles. They managed to combine political centralization and the sort of state-like functions with the influence of lineage, with the influence of family and clan. One great example would be traditional Rwanda, the state in Rwanda. The state in Rwanda, was called the Nyiginya Kingdom. It was named after a clan, the royal clan, Nyiginya clan. And it was organized around the clans, and as the state spread, it integrated people into the clan system. So the lineage structure was kind of fundamental to the way the state worked. So they combined those two principles.
Yeah, and in this decentralization and a lot of polities, I was thinking of what type of, as I call the African researcher you are. And there are a few strands. Some are Pan-Africanists, coming from the lineage of Nkrumah, and others who think that there is gains in unity, right? And this is where the African Union project came from. And I think your theory and vision here is one in which that you share the message of this, which is to celebrate the achievements of Africa.
Yeah.
Is that the unity tries to get to some benefits. And there are some achievements in Africa that we're going to expand on in this conversation. But I wanted to situate you where you are in this because I think it's important for viewers as well. And on another strand, you have also the decolonial thinkers of Fanon, Membe, and others, and who have been thinking of how to undo some of the colonial aspects that happened. And with them, you share, I think, this idea that we need to think of what are the pre-existing institutions of Africa, but you share a different methodology because your methodology is really to convince the mainstream, to convince and use the methods and the techniques that economists use. You don't call yourself a heterodox economist. So what emerges, like you said, that this lack of centralization was by choice.
Yeah.
It's a theory of Africa where with African agency.
Yes, absolutely.
And this African agency has consequences,
Yeah.
right? These are choices. So can you go and expound upon some, you mentioned the lack of polarization,
Yeah.
but some of other, like more achievement and great consequences that wealthy people would deliver to Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you got it exactly right, that, I want to emphasize here the kind of African agency of, like, Africans organize these societies for a purpose, and they were successful. They achieved, in some sense, what they set out to do. But, of course, that had enormous negative unintended consequences in the early modern and modern period because, in building these societies, you couldn't anticipate the spread of European mercantile capitalism, the demand for slaves in the Americas, the coming of European colonialism. Just think about colonialism. It's obvious that, the states that were able to resist colonization were large states. Ethiopia, Ethiopia that, Menelik, King Menelik was able to defeat the Italians because he could put a huge army in the field, the Zulu, same thing with the Zulus, So most African polities were far too small to be able to defeat European powers' military, and they suffered from divide and rule. The British exploited, So just to give you a flavor of, like, how this argument kind of leads to some of the kind of negative dynamics, in the early modern and modern period. But as you say, that doesn't mean the future has to be the same as the past. Africans chose how to organize themselves in the past, and they can choose how to organize themselves in the future, and they can do something different. And I think what I see and what I've been trying to study is that when they do that, when Africans do that, they do it in their own way, in their own cultural context. They're not just like borrowing Western institutions, or they're not just downloading. No, things have to make sense in the local context. I think
where, for instance, have they scaled up their local institutions?
Well, I think Botswana is a fantastic example. That's what I learned 30 years ago. That the secret of the success of Botswana was they were able to take these traditional institutions like the Hotla, these sort of councils or these assemblies, and they were able to recreate that in the post-colonial state in a way that made those institutions relevant for the post-colonial state, that made politicians and civil servants accountable, not in some kind of Western sense of, but in the traditional sense of accountable to the people in the Hotla, and so that was a piece of kind of political genius in some sense by Seretse Khama, by the early Ket Maziri, the early post-colonial leaders. There was nothing inevitable about that. That had to be imagined and it had to be invented. In fact, Gaborone, the capital, was a greenfield site. So there was no Hotla in Gaborone. But Seretse Khama insisted to the British they had to build Hotlas in Gaborone. Who's the chief? It's like, there's a greenfield site. Where's the chief? They invented chief. Tlokwen, the chief in Tlokwen, basically appointed Khossis. So the whole thing was invented. It's not just some, simple reproduction of some tradition. No, it had to be invented, and it had to be invented like, how is this going to work in the post-colonial state? So there was a lot of creativity involved in that. So, and I see that with all of these success stories. I think, go back to the 1950s, go back to the 1960s. That's what Julius Nyerere had in mind. Julius Nyerere was extremely aware that it was going to be very difficult to govern these post-colonial states in Africa. And he was very clear about how Western institutions were not going to work and why they were not going to work. And I think Ujamaa, that was an attempt to kind of bring a model of how to build a post-colonial state in Tanzania, in that very difficult political context that colonialism had bequeathed. And I think the many other people, Sekou Touré, Senghor, Nkrumah, there were different models. Even President Mobutu, in his own way, actually, in his early years, had a model of how to govern Congo. It was a very traditional model based on kind of scaling up a traditional model of a chief, but it was a kind of culturally grounded model. Of course, that didn't work either, but But that's okay. You know, you always fail. You know, as a researcher, you have ideas, they don't work. That's okay. You try more ideas, you know. So I think that spirit of innovation is something that, you know, is sorely needed in Africa.
So not one size fits all solutions, but some experimentation. And certainly Africa can learn then from its pre-colonial goals and institutions, broadly said. But you, in your view of African agency as well, and I think you don't take it just one way that Africa learns. You want to learn about Africa.
Yeah.
So what can the world learn then from Africa?
Many things, you know. I think, you know, so my view, you know, we've been discussing is sort of like one way of thinking about it is, you know, Africa took a different path into the modern world than Europe did, for example, or Eurasia did. So, you know, they built different institutions, they experimented with different ways of organizing society, you know. And so I always think, well, they tried things that, you know, us English people didn't, you know, so maybe we have something to learn from them. They experimented with something that we didn't. And like, how can we learn from that? So one of the things I've been trying to pay a lot of attention is to like, what can we learn from that? So here's an example I didn't give, you know, you haven't heard yet. But one of my friends at the University of Nigeria, one of my colleagues, Francis Njoku, who's a professor of philosophy, he's very good with Igbo proverbs, you know. And one of his favorite Igbo proverbs, which I find very relevant for the United States, is the tall man is required when setting the roof of the house. The short man is needed when you're looking for something on the floor. You know, and the Igbo have this kind of idea of like, everybody's good at something. Like everybody has their talent, everybody has their ability, everyone's good at something. And that is very different from the United States. You know, in the United States, there's like winners and there's losers. You know, there's losers, don't work hard enough, didn't study, you know, and there's winners. You know, this whole meritocracy, this ideology of meritocracy, kind of lauding the winners, you know. And I, like for me, in Africa, there's much more of a sort of philosophy of kind of everybody contributes in their own way and everybody has a place, you know. And that's a very nice kind of ontological perspective, it seems to me, you know. And I think there's many other things like that. You know, one example I love, going back to the hotla in Botswana, is, you know, no one votes in a hotla. You know, you make decisions, but nobody votes. Like, how do you make decisions? By consensus. You know, the chief sums up the consensus, but somebody objects. Okay, fine, let's keep discussing. You know, we keep discussing. And so how could that possibly work? You know, if I talk to my colleagues, I say, how could you make decisions like that? Well, maybe it's difficult in a large society. Nyerere discussed this, you know, quite extensively, you know, like this, you know, what he called palaver. Like, you know, that doesn't work in a large-scale modern state. Maybe it has to be institutionalized in different ways or whatever. But one thing I find fascinating, of course, going back to wealth in people, you know, is that wealth in people, the whole notion of wealth in people is related to Ubuntu, this idea that, you know, I am because we are, that there's a sort of collective consciousness, that the importance of the community. And in some sense, that's what, working in Botswana, I realized that's why this thing kind of works. You can attain consensus because you're not primarily interested in yourself. You're interested in some collective choice or some collective decision. So you have to think about what other people want. And that makes it much easier to reach consensus on things. So there's, you know, for me, like in living in such a polarized society as the United States, also this idea of like trying to think about the community and consensus also, like that's something that we have a lot to learn from, that impulse.
A lot to learn from. And when you talked about sharing with the people, and at the end of the day, even a stranger is another person. You talk about that. And one interesting artifact is the word, you know, you have this map of countries where the word for stranger and guest is the same. Yeah. So Senegal, we use gan for both, for stranger and and a guest.
Yeah.
What do you find in this map, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, I think that's about the historical relationship between African societies. You know, like these 45,000, all these tens of thousands of polities had to find an equilibrium with each other. And I think, you know, we know historically the Bantu expansion, Africans migrated, they moved around, you know, most African societies are mixtures of every society in the world is a mixture of all sorts of people. But I think in this, you know, this historical process of movement and migration and this idea of wealth in people, it becomes very natural to welcome strangers and outsiders. So I think this fact that in, you know, 80% of people in Africa speak languages in which the word for guest and stranger are the same is actually extremely significant. Guest and stranger, you know, because people are valuable. You want to integrate people into your society. And I should say that this is a completely African phenomenon. This is not true of any language except Hawaiian. For reasons that I don't understand. This is a completely African phenomenon, which I find absolutely fascinating, this guest and stranger. So I think, again, that's indicative of the kind of the nature of this equilibrium in Africa.
Where, you know, the clan matters, but having relations matters as well. So everyone is welcomed, like in the Teranga of Senegal. So you are very welcome here. But I wanted to put you a little bit to the limits of wealth in people, but more as a contribution to add, which is there are certain parts of Africa. You mentioned many parts of Anglophone Africa, East Africa, South Africa as well, and parts that are less centralized. There are also parts of Africa that are more centralized, but there are examples there where wealthy people actually are great examples as well. So we know, so Senegal is part of the Muslim Africa, and it's not just imported Islam. It has been here for a very long time, like in many countries, 97%. 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africans also are Muslim, and 20 out of the 54 states are Muslim majority in Africa. So, but Senegal has an interesting example, right, in wealth in people. We just concluded a weekend-long trip in Touba with the brotherhoods and the Sufi brotherhoods. Can you tell us what inspired you? What are some of your raw field trip conclusions and hypotheses when it comes to these Sufi brotherhoods we met?
Yeah, I think what I find, you know, what you know, the reason how, you know, how we got discussing the Murids and you know is I'm very, you know, the reason I've been doing research in Botswana or Rwanda or Somaliland or whatever it is, you know, because I'm interested in trying to understand these successes in Africa and stop studying failure, but start studying success and see what you can say about that. And I think the Murids seems to be a fantastically interesting example of a sort of success of a kind of, you know, indigenous African reaction to colonialism. You know, in some sense, Sheikh Bamba was kind of provided an alternative, you know, like in the 19th century when the Wolof states collapsed, when France was expanding, the Murids, Sheikh Bamba, provided a kind of a way for society to sort of adjust and reorganize itself in a way, you know, in the face of French colonialism, in a way which was autonomous from the French, and it created a very powerful identity, of course, you know, heavily based in Islam, and a sort of organization gave people meaning, gave people some kind of sense of meaning, you know, in this crisis of colonialism. So I found that aspect of it absolutely fascinating, and just trying to understand how it influences the economy and how it's organized, and I think my conclusion, you know, from the weekend we were there is, you know, it's a very African institution. At the same time, we were talking to a professor at the university in Touba, and he was talking about the hitma and you know, and I said, you know, and talking about the philosophical principles, and I said, isn't that just like Ubuntu? And he said, yes, yes, it is. Yes, it is. You know, and the way, for example, that work is organized, labor is organized. Again, you know, that's a very African way of doing things. If you look historically at Africa, the way African economic institutions worked, how did you mobilize labor? Not through a labor market, through your kinship system, through your social network, through your people. And it seems like now they still have the same thing. You know, they have these dairas, you know, you have these people who cooperate, they work together to some common task. You know, like it's organized, organizationally African in a fundamental way, but of course it's also heavily inspired by Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy and principles. And so it's a sort of fusion of those two things in a kind of fascinating way, I would say.
Yeah, fascinating. And we learned up there about the concepts of khidma and the ndigel that we have also from the leaders, creating a focal point for the mobilization of the people towards a common goal. And hopefully it is potentially something that Senegal and the world can learn from. And so I'm really delighted. I think we'll open the floor very soon to the audience to ask their questions. As a young economist, what I learned from you, spending quality time with you since before even you won the prize, is to follow your curiosities. You started as a theorist of political economy towards doing empirical work on comparative development, following your curiosity on the success of Botswana, focusing on one work, and not just staying in your office at Harvard or University of Chicago, but touching the matter. I remember you using that exact word as a macroeconomist, to touch the matter and go and speak and talk to the people, to really not just be as an armchair economist, and really go at the bottom of the things. And that's a methodology that all can benefit from, all those people who care about what we call here in Africa, endogenous economics, indigenous and endogenous economics, to create our own theories. For that, we need to go and speak with the people to understand the reality, because many times urban elites don't even know what happens in the rural parts. And I must say, that's why I called you an African economist, because you knew much more about many parts of Africa. I'm embarrassed to say about that, but I hope that that will change over time. And I wanted to really thank you again, James. I'm going to open the floor for some questions that our guests will take.
Yeah, I'm Abdoulaye. I am an international consultant in international development. I was former worker at the World Bank. I was with USAID for more than 20 years. And really, I spent my time traveling around the world. And what I heard here is really a retour of experience. It is really important. And I will call for Abdurrahman to really translate this kind of things in local languages, in Pular, in Wolof, in others. Because what you are saying is really what people don't. When you go to development, when you talk about development, having this kind of discussion at a very top notch, because you are Nobel Prizes in economy, and also you know around the world what is economics is going. You know the Western countries, and you know better for Africa. And I think we need to hear from others, because in Africa the problem is Africa is not good only for Africans. It's good for others, but it's really difficult to find Africans. They want to live like me. I prefer Africa everywhere in the world. I can be a citizen of American or other, but I chose to be a Senegalese and stay in Africa. It's my choice. I'm a Fulani. I'm happy with my herds and my cows. And I think my father tell me one thing. If you want to raise your children with the value and dignity you grew up, but educate them with the future of the world they will be. And the problem in Africa is education is really I can say the big issue, because we are educated not for worlds that we will compete with others, but we are educated with a model that will put us under this competition very unfair. And the capitalism is one thing about. And if we see now the political economy of the Sahelian countries where we have this extreme violence is coming on. But in the past, as you said, in Haiti, knowing the history of the country, where the history of this part of Africa, Sahel, was with empire or the trade road between the western and the northern of Africa. I think it's something that we should learn to solve the problem, but we are only putting things that is not. And really, I want to say thank you, and I'm really pleased to be part of the discussion. Over.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Abda, for hosting us. I think it's great to be here, and thank you for this fascinating discussion. So I'm going to be provocative a little bit, if you allow me. So first, when you talk about Africa, Africa is so vast and diverse. So whenever we talk about Africa, I'm like, which Africa are we talking about? Is Algeria same as South Africa? Do you have the same dynamic in terms of institutions and values in a country like Morocco versus Congo that you mentioned? So I found that a little, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around Africa when we talk about Africa. So that's the first observation. The second has to do with, we talk about, we have agencies and things were great before the colonial time, and and colonialism with all its faults, right? They came and destroyed a lot. But did you look at what was as well weak in our own institutions that allowed, at the first place, colonialism to do the bad things that it has done in our countries? And why, as you said, in Ethiopia they resisted, in others less so. And I think that there are issues in our own society that we, in Africa, if I can say Africa, that we have to look at very, I think, without being naive, what's good, the good, the bad, and the ugly about our societies. And I think that lecture or that lens, to me, could be quite interesting. And my last point is that the fact that the only great examples that we're able to give is Botswana is a bit as well heartbreaking, because I think if things in terms of values, in terms of institution, which I think are very important in the work and in the book that you work with, Asemoglu, why aren't we able to give more examples than Botswana? Thank you.
Yeah. So I respond? Yeah. Yes. So I mean, so those are all great questions. I think the traditional, like the way I think about, so there's a big debate amongst African intellectuals about whether you should talk about Africa or not, and some people say yes, but many African intellectuals, like Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, had no problem in talking about Africa. But when he talked but some people talk about sub-Saharan Africa, and some people talk about Africa. So why do people talk about? So when I say Africa, what I usually mean is sub-Saharan Africa, because the argument is North Africa was subject to very different historical processes. North Africa was very intensively integrated into this Mediterranean world. It had the expansion, the Arab expansion, the spread of Islam happened in a very different way than further south and it was part of the Roman Empire. It was subject to very different historical processes. So that's why people usually think of sub-Saharan Africa as something we can talk about, as separate from North Africa. Obviously, there's things in common in every human society, and even the notion of wealth in people. You can find societies in South Asia that have something very close to wealth in people. All humans have this ancestral history in common. We all evolved in Africa, and we spread out all over the world, and we took some things with us, when we did that. So I don't want to say what happened in Africa is completely unique, because it isn't. I mean, in the book I talk about this, but we didn't. So that's my first comment. The way I try to defend talking about Africa is that sub-Saharan Africa is actually, there's many things in very different parts of Africa which are common, like religious ideas, the importance of ancestors, for example. Think of this example of Ubuntu. You know, that's a Soto word. You know, that comes from Southern Africa. But you find that everywhere, this notion of the kind of joint, you know, the personhood. Like personhood has to be defined in the context of the community. Even Tuba, I found it on Friday. So that where does that come from? I think that comes from this historical process of borrowing, of migration, of, you know, like cultural ideas spread, technology spread, you know, metaphysical ideas spread, you know, and that creates like many social institutions, age sets, age grades. You have age grades in Southern Africa, you have East Africa, you have them in West Africa, you know, you have secret societies. You have secret societies in West Africa, you have them in Congo, you have... So I think what that's, for me, is... So when I talk about like this kind of, the importance of family and lineage and clan and the political consequences of that, I see that that could be manifested in different ways in Kenya, in Zambia, in Nigeria, but I still see that there in the different... So I think that's the way I would defend talking about Africa. And you're right, you know, Botswana, why is Botswana an exception? You know, you could say there were, you know, why is Botswana an exception? I think because, you know, for me, the fundamental kind of problem in post-colonial Africa was captured by, you know, the Nigerian sociologist Peter Eke, who had this notion of the two publics. Like the fundamental post-colonial problem is that, you know, Africa was so decentralized politically, those different societies had different social contracts, they had different political institutions, and the colonial powers came and they plonked this thing on top, you know, and they brought their own institutions, and they said, oh, let's have a Westminster-style government in, you know, in Nigeria. And how did that relate to all of these underlying institutions, which were themselves so different? And I think that trying to kind of project the sort of order, you know, of the kind of historic societies in Africa and find a way of building a legitimate post-colonial state, that's the problem that most African countries have not been able to solve. And the colonial powers created things like the military. Where did the military? There was no historical precedent for the military. How do you control the military? You know, so I think Botswana was able to solve that problem, you know, because Bechuanaland was characterized by these assemblies, these hotlers. You know, there were these different Swana groups, but they had these institutions in common, and they were able to kind of build those institutions. I think, you know, if you look at like Ujamaa or African socialism, what was African socialism? African socialism was the idea that, what is it that all Africans have in common? Like, they have this communal nature. Like, you know, like if you read what Nyerere said about that, it's like he understood we need to find some access of like that people can cooperate on. People, there's all these different identities, different languages, different ethnicities. How do we get them all working together? We need to find something that cuts across, that they all have in common. What do they have in common? Familyhood. They have this notion of the community. So I think African socialism maybe didn't work very well, but I think for me it was a brilliant attempt to solve this problem of the two publics, you know. And so I think that's a very hard problem, and that's why most African countries haven't solved it, you know, and that's why, for me, that's the biggest development problem in Africa today. You still can't create legitimate, functional state institutions in Africa, like hardly ever, you know. So, and democracy didn't solve that problem either. Western-style democracy didn't solve the problem either, and that's why you have all these military regimes everywhere, because that was no more appropriate in 1990 than it was in 1960, like, for me, you know. So I mean, go back to Botswana again, you know. How did that happen in Botswana? Botswana had a one-party state for 60 years. It was a one-party state. It was not a Western democracy. The same party won every single election. How did that produce good governance? It produced good governance through the hudla, through the traditional institutions, not through some Western mechanism. You know, in the United States, we're all hanging. You know, the election, President Trump wins by a few 100,000 votes or something, and everything changes. Like, that's, you know, so I think, like, I'm not advocating one-party rule or whatever. I'm advocating respect for traditional, you know, the way. And I, like, something I've learned also is this word traditional is, like, ridiculous, you know. Like, it's not traditional and modern, you know. We're all traditional and modern at the same time. And, you know, English people, Africans, and I guess I've just, you know, in my work, I've always just come up to this point of, like, seeing, like, the modernity of African institutions, or the extent to which Africans value their traditions and they value their institutions, and I think that's you know, that's, for me, that's helped understand these successes like Botswana, like Rwanda. You know, Rwanda is controversial because of Mr. Kagame, but the way everything works in Rwanda is by appealing to traditional concepts in the society. You know, like all of the big policy. Poverty reduction policy, what is that? Girinka, give people a cow. Like, why a cow? Like, who at the World Bank would ever think of giving someone a cow? But because it's so culturally important in Rwanda. Like, cows are incredibly important culturally. The whole imihigo, like, all these homegrown solutions. You work with things that resonate with people in their cultural context, that make sense to them. That gets them to cooperate and work together. So I agree. There's too few success stories, and that's a tragedy. But I think you know, that's a consequence of these problems. You know, and I think I don't want to say historically Africa was this paradise. I didn't say that at all. You know, I think there were lots of problems for organizing society in this way. You know, it made it very difficult to trade. There were lots of frictions. It made it, you know, like it held back economic development in many ways, you could say, you know, technological development within Africa historically. So all I said is I think that's what people chose. You know, you could say there's trade-offs or something, but I think the main thing is just these unintended consequences. You know, people can reorganize their societies when they understand that there's problems, and, you know, but Africans didn't get the chance to reorganize their societies in the modern world because they were invaded from outside, and that restricted many of the options for reorganizing. I mean, that's another part of the Botswana story, that they got the space to kind of reorganize things.
So you interpret this as a choice to achieve other of the society's organization led to other outcomes that the ones that maybe you would think in a more Adam Smith, the spirit of capitalism kind of outcome. So your interpretation is that Africa achieved language diversity, ethnic diversity, and links with these people. And these are things that they value, that people value in Africa.
Yeah. I think that, you know, you could argue that that had significant economic costs, you know, historically. Probably didn't matter that much before the Industrial Revolution, but it made it very difficult, you know, to have the kind of economic dynamics that went on in Western society, you know. But you know, Western society didn't organize itself in anticipation of all these consequences that were going to follow. That was a kind of unintended consequence also, you know. So I don't think you can blame Africans for not understanding all the consequences of organizing their society like that. I'm just, you know, I think what we see in world history is that, think about Japan, what happened in Japan in the 19th century, when Japan realized, you know, in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1860s, that they were massively behind the West technologically in terms of many sorts of institutions. What did they do? They reorganized their society. You know, they reorganized the political system. They sent missions abroad. They borrowed technology. Many Africans tried to do that too. The Asante state tried to borrow Western technology. They sent people to Britain to help build a railway, build an armaments factory, sensible thing. You know, many African societies tried to do that. The Emperor Menelik in Ethiopia did the same thing, but it was cut short. The same thing that happened in Japan was stopped in Africa by colonialism.
Great. We're gonna have another intervention.
So, as a foreign economist, what impact has Africa had on you, and how has it shaped you, actually? That's what I want to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
How has Africa shaped?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just very curious about the world. I think when I was young, I was just sort of fascinated by all this kind of variation in the world, you know, like why people just kind of organize all these different, you know, human beings, as we were discussing earlier, we have this history kind of in common, but we spread around the world and we created just very different sorts of societies. And I guess I always found that sort of super fascinating. Like why pay so much attention to Africa? You know, because the most variation is in Africa. You know, in eastern Nigeria, you can go from one village to the next village and they have a different political system. You know, they have different institutions. You know, it's just, I remember once working in the north of Sierra Leone, and we were going to, with a friend of mine, a Sierra Leonean friend of mine, we were going to elections for paramount chiefs. And we were in like Temne land. And then we went from one village, you know, which was Temne, to another village which was Loko, and then another village which was Limba, you know, right next to each other. And the kind of that variation sort of blew my mind. And I think like that is one of the reasons why for me Africa is so fascinating as a social scientist, because humans were here longer, like hundreds of thousands of years longer than they were anywhere else on the world. So they had more time to experiment with different ways of organizing society. So I think that's, you know, I think like part of the reason, you know, I kind of developed these ideas in the way I have also is, you know, I used to teach, when I was at Harvard, I used to teach a class on the political economy of Africa with a very distinguished political scientist called Robert Bates. And Robert would stand up and it would be poverty, civil war, you know, massacre, chaos, like the whole thing. And then I just had this enormous kind of crisis, you know, because I sat there thinking, like, when I go to Africa, you know, I get off the plane in Nigeria and I feel happy. So why is that? You know, it's not because I like civil war or dictatorship or poverty, and I like electricity and running water too. But there's just something so fascinating as an academic about being there and kind of studying it and learning. And so I think, you know, I'd like other parts of the world. You know, my wife is from Colombia. I love Colombia, you know, but somehow it just doesn't have what Africa has.
What Africa has, a lot of fascinating stories to tell. Now, we're gonna have here.
Je soutiens que pour bâtir une Afrique prospère, une Afrique éthique, une Afrique résiliente, notre développement ne doit pas se faire par le mimétisme. Ça doit passer par le respect de nos valeurs et nos richesses africaines. Ce qui me pousse à vous poser cette question, est-ce que vous pensez que notre patrimoine culturel, nos philosophies de solidarité, de consensus et le respect de notre écosystème africain constituent une éthique indispensable pour la croissance économique en Afrique? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. So Mohammed's question is that Africa cannot be prosperous by mimetism, by copying what is outside of Africa. So he's asking whether you think that Africa can build on its culture, its solidarity to achieve good development outcomes.
Yeah, I think yes, I think is the answer to that. You know, I think that, you know, most experiences of economic growth, like successful economic growth, are very culturally rooted. You know, like take the Chinese case, actually. You know, when China made this transition in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the the first way in which they industrialized was creating what they called township village enterprises. So at the time, you had state-owned industry. It was communism. You had this state-owned industry and very small private businesses, very small. And so they wanted to create a private sector. So what did the private sector look like? They created what called township village enterprises, which were owned collectively, basically, by local governments. So it wasn't like an entrepreneur with a private business and, you know, a limited liability. No, it was a collective entity, you know, and it was a kind of coalition between the government and the people. Township village enterprises disappeared, but if you go to China today, there's an enormous amount of coalition between the government and the private sector. Like, there's no government here, private sector there, like there is in the United States, supposedly. There's all the time this fusion, in some sense, this kind of these joint ventures. So how is that? I think that's incredibly culturally rooted in China, that in traditional Chinese society, there's no real distinction between civil society and the state. Those two things are kind of linked together. You know, the whole notion of Confucian, the Confucian organization of society, you know, the famous image is like a stone, you drop a stone in a pond, and then the ripples spread out, you know. And so in Confucianism, you know, the way to create a well-functioning society is you rectify yourself, you personally, you know, you return to the rights, as you say, you know, you make yourself better. It's a bit like Sheikh Bamba's jihad against yourself, actually. You start with yourself and you create proper behavior in yourself. You return to the rights. That's what Confucius said. What do you mean by rights? He meant music. He meant, you know, sacrifice ancestors. He meant, you know, proper social norms. And if you do that, that will spread to your family. It will spread to your friends. And it spreads all the way up to the government. That's the way Confucius had it. So the individual and the government are kind of linked together in kind of one thing. So when I look at the organization of economic development in China, whether it be township village enterprises or all these joint ventures today, I see that same thing. It's like there's no notion of the state and society separate. They're all kind of working together in, you know, just the way Confucius said, you know, and I think that's true in South Korea. It's true. So I think all of the, you know, there's no reason that capitalism has to be organized around this kind of hyper individual Western model. That's not how things work in China at all, actually. You know, so I think there will be an African model of capitalism. I don't know what that looks like. As the lady was saying, you know, we have small-scale examples, and we have Botswana, but you could say, well, Botswana, it's minerals, it's diamonds, sure, you know, but where will economic dynamism come from in Africa? You know, will it be? I don't know the answer to that. You know, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will happen. You know, when I was a student in England, you know, in the early 1980s, we learned that China was backward. You know, China had a terrible 200 years. In the 18th century, the Qing state collapsed. You know, the state was corrupt. Public goods collapsed. The Grand Canal collapsed. In the 19th century, there was the Taiping Rebellion. There was warfare. There was colonialism. There was the Opium Wars. The state collapsed. There was a civil war. There was, you know, horrible history, horrible 200 years of history. And then suddenly China starts growing at 10% a year for 50 years. So I always think of that when I think about Africa, because you think like, okay, Africa's had all these troubles. It's had colonialism. It's had poverty. It's had been difficult to build states. But at some point, you're going to find a way to solve these problems. And then Africa's going to explode, I think. So what does that solution look like? I don't know. I don't think we know. But it's going to happen. And I think it's, yeah.
Thought-provoking
Yeah.
comparison with China. So we're going to take our final intervention before we wrap it up with last words. and conclude this beautiful evening in the presence of James Robinson.
So much. My name is Baptiste Djabou, but I want to ask my question in French. Je suis très ravi d'être là et je tiens à remercier mon grand frère et ami Abdoulaye de nous avoir invités. Et je tiens aussi à vous féliciter et à vous remercier, M. Ndiaye et Rabisson. J'étais ce matin à l'université et j'ai appris beaucoup de choses et je suis très ravi. Alors, nous avons en face de nous un champion, un économiste, et sur toute la richesse de l'Afrique, l'Afrique peine encore à avoir la souveraineté économique. Et je voudrais poser deux questions. Ma première question, c'est une question terre à terre. Et je le pose en tant que ma casque d'entrepreneur, chef d'entreprise. Aujourd'hui, le constat en Afrique en est que quand la banque vous prête de l'argent, les taux d'intérêt sont plus élevés qu'en Europe ou en Occident. Et je me pose la question, pourquoi cela? Étant donné que le taux aurait pu être beaucoup plus élevé dans les pays développés que dans les pays sous-développés. Et cela me permet de poser la question à savoir, est-ce que les banques sont pour le développement des pays développés? Et quelle est votre perception par rapport au plan Lacrosse de chez Anta Diop pour le développement de l'Afrique, qui a été malheureusement rejeté? Et aujourd'hui, ma dernière question, c'est de savoir, aujourd'hui, vous avez donné l'exemple de la Botswana, et chez Anta Diop l'a dit, aujourd'hui, la sécurité précède le développement. Et en Afrique, tant que l'Union africaine n'existe pas, ça sera difficile pour les pays africains de se développer durablement. Ça sera toujours des développements à un temps bien déterminé. Et quel est votre conseil pour la souveraineté, qui est la souveraineté monétaire en Afrique? Et je vous remercie.
Thank you. The questions are around economic sovereignty and overall around the role of banks.
Yeah.
We find that banks, there is some sort of lack of missing financial markets, essentially, where banks do not provide either loans at very high rates or barely do it. So how should we think of the role of banks in Africa that seem to be less done in a less efficient way as banks in Europe or the US, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would think. I mean, I think financial institutions are extremely important. I think, if you think about a process of economic development as being about entrepreneurship and, investment, then, people have ideas for businesses or they have investment opportunities, but they don't have wealth. So the financial institutions are extremely important in, moving capital around to people who can use it in socially productive ways. But I think, I would think the problems of banking system that you're discussing are a kind of consequence of a kind of deeper institutional problems. That if you have a government, like I was talking about this problem of the two publics, that if you have a national government that is not really accountable to people, it's not really working in the collective interest, it's working in the interests of the people who control the government, then you're not going to get a regulatory environment. You're not going to get a regulatory environment that would stimulate a kind of nationally desirable banking industry. You're going to get an environment that creates banking monopolies, because banking monopolies can generate wealth for politically powerful people. You see that everywhere in the world. And, you know, so that's good for politically powerful people, but it's not good for building a financial industry that really supports economic growth and economic development. So I think solving basic institutional problems with respect to the state and accountability will help to build state institutions that can regulate banks and the financial sector better, that can make them better agents of this process of economic growth.
It was a fantastic exchange with the audience. Many questions raised, including, should there be a theory of Africa? We know these are hard questions. How should the theory look like? What are the implications of James' theory of wealth in people? There are some costs, there are some benefits. At the end of the day, these are choices that African societies have made. And African societies can make choices in the future, as James emphasized, that can shape their destiny. So this book, metaphorically, your book is being written, just as the book of Africa is being written. But I wanted to end on one note. Thank you really very much, James, for engaging in this exchange and conversation here in the continent. I wanted to add that James doesn't lack, or scholars in the West in general don't lack opportunities to have these exchange back and forth with your co-authors and so on. But as someone who is interested a lot in Africa, you're interested in Africa, this is a great opportunity because studies show that only 25% of research work about Africa is written by scholars in Africa. So it's great that we can have these conversations in Africa. And like Usman Semben said, Africa is my audience and the world is my market. And we appreciate and we thank Amani for having Africa as their audience and world thinkers as their market of ideas. So thank you also for giving me the honor and opportunity to moderate this exchange. To the next time.